after hibernating for such a long time on my system, it works. But this is looking good. Yes. Welcome to Neuroccino, everyone. Hibernating. Such a long time on my system, it works. Here we go. Okay. 9:31 Monday morning. This is going to be the last Neuroccino before the summer break, because we're all going to go and travel to conferences or take beautiful holidays. So welcome to the last Neuroccino for a little while. And then we'll be back after the summer. I would say when the weather is better, worse, but for us here, that doesn't actually apply. It's going to be when the weather is finally good, I guess. And then we have also this next CNS talk scheduled for the 25th of September. That's all I had. Eduardo has a paper for us today on language and aging, and I saw you already shared the link in the chat.
Yep.
So whenever you're ready, take it away.
Okay, you should be able to see my screen, right?
Now we can. There's gray bars on the sides. If you want to zoom in a little bit, we have it full screen. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So I picked this paper because we had the opportunity last week at the MPI to speak with Jonathan Peel, the main guy from this group in the States. Published a couple of years ago this study, and he's working on speech perception and healthy aging. So I thought it might be a good opportunity also to share on the Neuroccino this week. Specifically, this paper, they looked at the they compared newly collected data from an older sample to some data they already collected a few years ago with younger adults, so like usually the usual like university students performing a language auditory like a sentence comprehension task. And what they wanted to look at was specifically a couple of hypotheses. The first one was to check and to investigate whether there's, for example, a stronger involvement of the right hemisphere in older subjects compared to younger population. And secondly, whether the syntactic effect that is usually found in younger population, according to which more complex sentences induce a stronger response, specifically in the left hemisphere, is also present in this older population. And they also carried out some interesting like single subject level analysis correlating some behavioral index with the individual functional brain data.
Eduardo, sorry to interrupt you. Is there anything you can do with your sound, because you're quite truncated?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Because I'm from home and I don't have headphones. Can you hear me like decently now?
It's tricky.
I'm sorry.
No headphones, nothing?
Yeah, nothing. Sorry, I forgot them in the office. Okay, I'll try to speak slowly, so that hopefully you can hear me well enough, at least to understand. It's interesting because one of the conditions of this experiment is listening without vocoded speech, which might be what you experience right now. Anyway, yeah, the task for this experiment was sentence auditory comprehension task. So subject were listening to sentences presented auditorily in a couple of conditions. So like normally recorded speech and vocoded speech, which is spectrally poorer version of a normal hearing experience. I can show you actually. Yeah, here the spectrum. So on the top panel, you have a normal sentence as we usually experience. In the mid panel, there is this so-called accorded speech, which is basically they were developed in the first place, if I got it correctly, to simulate the experience of cochlear implant hearing experience. So it's still an intelligible speech, but it has a poorer spectrum, which is smoother. If you can look at the details, it's somehow smoother than the normal hearing experience. So you can still understand quite perfectly the words and the sentences, but there are much fewer details in the speech content. And then they had a baseline condition for like basically noise, just a general baseline condition. So they had these two conditions, and they also had another condition to generate a 2x2 factorial design, which was syntactically more complex or less complex sentences. What they found at the behavioral level, and with this older population, it's quite interesting but kind of expected. You can see it in this panel C, this bar plot. The bluish bar represent the subject relative clauses, so those sentences with a simpler syntax, technically. And there was an effect of auditory degradation, with like the clear normal speech being easier than the degraded speech, of course. And there was also a main effect of the syntax, so the reddish bar representing the object relative clauses. Generally, people had a lower performance in this task, and the differences were statistically significant. They also compared these data with the younger population. There was a difference with younger subjects generally performing better than the older population. And then they proceeded to analyze the functional MRI data, which I would like to show you in these images. So these sort of general expected results. You have all sentences against noise, and you can see the classical left hemisphere, perisylvian language areas, some frontal dorsal areas. There's some activity in the right hemisphere as well, and in the subcortical structures. There is an effect of syntax as well. So they replicated this finding, which is usually the case in younger populations. Object relative clauses, which are considered more difficult, they engage specifically the left hemisphere and the insular cortex more than the subject relative clauses. And then, so these are all data from the older population, but the comparison between younger and older population yielded to these results with for the general task for all the sentences. They found that there was a set of areas, mostly in the right hemisphere, that were more active in the older adults compared to the younger adults. And you can see there is a cluster in the right insula inferior frontal gyrus in the top line. There is a cluster in the dorsal frontal cortex, and some cluster in the cerebellum here at the bottom. The part that I found most interesting, though, is the individual level analysis, where they correlated the accuracy in the task, so the general accuracy they had in performing the auditory task with the neural activity. So you have like the x-axis is the accuracy, and the y-axis is the activity, the involved signal. And as you can see, there is a set of areas, a couple of them in the cerebellum, and in a couple of them in the, well, there's the right inferior frontal gyrus and the supplementary motor cortex, which is in the midbrain, in the middle section of the brain. And in these areas, the accuracy correlated negatively with the activity in these areas, meaning that the participants who had a better performance in the task showed less activity in these areas. So there was modulation at individual level with within these areas. They then restricted this analysis to the comparison between more or less complex sentences, syntactically more or less complex, and they found a correlation within a set of areas, mostly in the left hemisphere, with again the supplemental motor areas, also the right cerebellum, which has cross connection with the left hemisphere, where so in this case we have still accuracy on the x-axis and activity on the y-axis. In this case, it's comparison of accuracies between subject and object relative clauses with higher scores, meaning, let's see if I remember correctly, a bigger mismatch between, So yeah, smaller scores indicate comparable performance between two syntactic conditions, while higher scores reflect worse performance in the more difficult sentences. So again, in the left hemisphere, there seems to be a set of areas that is sensitive to the syntactic complexity of the linguistic stimuli. And these areas showed increased activity as the effort seems to grow. This is the last image, I think. So overall, they interpreted these data quite cautiously, but more or less in the direction of a more effortful processing for older people with a wider engagement of the right hemisphere, which is possibly linked also to a more to the stimuli with a more degraded speech. The interpretation is quite cautious, though, because it's difficult to establish whether this is actually a more effortful processing. The behavioral data points in this direction because there is this correlation between the accuracy in the task and the activity index. And in this correlation maps, they used only the correct trials. So the accuracy is coming from the task as a whole, but the functional data are taken only from the correct trials, which somehow is in support of this compensatory hypothesis of the right hemisphere engagement, but also of the left hemisphere, because as you can see in this plot, there is a correlation between the complexity of the syntactic structure and activity of the somehow classical left hemisphere areas, but also not really classical, such as the left percentile gyrus is a bit tricky to interpret, but it could be considered outside or inside the language network. So yeah, these are the main results. So if you have any question or curiosity, please. I hope it was sufficiently clear.
Thank you, Eduardo. It was clear except for the audio. It felt like we were doing the task. First hands are up. Leva.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. Well, I will have a very simple question, actually two of them. So the graphs you presented, is that only older people or is that the whole sample, the accuracy graphs?
Oh yeah, no, these sorry, it's the specific these individual analyses are just the older sample, I think. Yeah, should be the case.
And can you explain to someone who doesn't use fMRI every single day what does subject relative and object relative is?
Yeah, that's more linguistic than fMRI related. An object relative clause is a sentence where you have a relative clause pending on the object of the sentence, while a subject relative clause, let's see if there is an example in the stimuli. Well, a subject relative clause is a sentence where you have a relative clause depending on the subject of the sentence. So, yeah. Yeah, okay. Okay, for example, subject relative structure. Brothers that 8 sisters are good, and the relative clause is depending on brothers, which is the subject of the sentence, and object relative clause. It's, for example, this one. Well, it's the same example. In this case, it's an ambiguous example, but you can interpret both ways.
So the reason the second graph you say it's more difficult, it's because you make an assumption that one is more effortful than another.
Yeah, they made this assumption that object relative clauses are more difficult. It's actually quite established in the literature. So it's the usual case. If you want syntactic modulation in your stimulus, it's quite frequent thing to use something like this. It's interesting though, because they have a behavioral effect in this sample, as you can see. But they also had this is the older paper from just the younger subjects. It was published 2016. In this case, it's the same experimental setting. It's just the sample that is different. They didn't found a behavioral difference correctly. They only found a neural difference. But overall, the accuracy was really, really high and not different between conditions. So in a certain way, you could also say it's interesting that this difference appears behaviorally only in the older population, for example.
Okay.
That answer your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I know it's quite a simple question, but I just wanted to make sure I understand. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Next one is Hervé.
Yeah. Thank you for the presentation, Eduardo. I want to know how they discuss their results in view of they talk a little bit, but I'm not sure how they discuss it about the compensation and the differentiation hypothesis in aging. So where in one case, compensation that you recruit more regions, more contralateral regions to have better performances, and the other is you recruit more regions, but you don't get better performances. So what I understood is that it's more about the differentiation where you don't get better at recruiting extra regions. Is it right?
Yeah, they discussed these results in light of these two hypotheses. They tend to go toward the somehow compensation from what I got, mostly because of this plot. So you have a better performance for low activity and only for the right trials. So they're not considering the errors or the mistaken trials. So this means that even to get the right answer, it takes more energy in the brain somehow to do that. But still, the interpretation is cautious, and it's not super clear what hypothesis should be supported more or less. But because I also asked this question to Jonathan Peel myself, because there's the assumption that language performance gets somehow worse with aging, which might be true for some subcomponents of language, but also, you might argue that older people have more experience with language as a whole, so that's like a better vocabulary, for example. So it's not necessarily worsening, but yeah, it's fairly complicated.
Okay, thanks.
And just to clarify, they only looked at language comprehension, nothing for production, right?
Yeah. Okay. The task itself was a button press, and they had to indicate who was the agent in the sentence. yeah, nothing comprehension.
It's a shame Sabrina is not here. That would have been right down her alley.
Yeah. But I thought this might have been interesting also in light of the presentation Müge gave us during the last meeting on
Do you want to expand where you see the connection to Müge's presentation?
It's nothing very specific, but the results were pointing to an involvement of the right hemisphere in some conditions. And well, also in this case, there's something in that direction. They discuss the right hemisphere involvement in language, which is interesting. If you look, for example, this paper from 2016 with the younger subjects, one interesting results they explain in more detail than this one on older population is this mismatch between the, for example, the acoustic rich or poor signal, so the vocodic speech modulation, which in younger subjects seems to produce sort of independent modulation compared to the syntactic modulation. So as you can see in this plot, there is, but the syntactic complexity tends to modulate the classic, somehow classic left hemisphere language network, temporal areas, frontal areas, while the acoustic richness of the stimulus produce a stronger modulation, mostly in the right hemisphere, as you can see here, and also in the left hemisphere, but there's quite a massive modulation in the right hemisphere, with the rich stimulus producing a stronger response.
I love that every time you tap into a network rather than isolated areas, it's complex and messy.
Yeah, it's quite messy. I just wanted to give you a taste of the.
Actually, not too bad. But yeah, you piqued Müge's interest. Müge, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Eduardo. I just missed what is do they have a conclusion about the lateralization in this case? First question, and the second question is they tried different like number of channel vocodings. So which do they focus on in these images?
Yeah, so I think they tried various options, and they kept the 24-channel recorded speech as intelligible speech. Here in the panel B on the right, there is a pilot study. Pilot study where they investigated the performance against different channels. I don't know if you can read it. It's a little bit small, maybe. There's they tried like clear speech and various channels. Basically, up to 16 channel, the accuracy it's quite high, and then it tends to decrease. So they picked the 24-channel recorded speech as intelligible speech, and then one channel as basically just noise, basically. Nothing. It's just noise. There's nothing understandable there.
Okay.
But yeah, the accuracy is it's quite high. There is this mismatch between object and subject relatives, which is expected. But yeah.
And about lateralization, like what?
Yeah, sorry. But lateralization, there's also some laterality index analysis, and there seems to be mismatch again, going more or less in the same direction as the results. I expose, but here you can see in table 4. There seems to be, generally speaking, a lower lateralization for older subjects. They consider like these big frontal, parietal, temporal, and cortical and cerebellar areas. But for all the sentence against noise and again the syntactic modulation, there seems to be a lower lateralization in the older population compared to the young population. So if you compare this column with this column, yeah.
So
That's
the
exactly
conclusion is that, like, as people get older, there is more, less lateralization because of maybe compensatory mechanisms for the aging, language network. So that something
Yeah,
like
that's a general conclusion. So there's less lateralization in the older population. The interpretation of why this happens, it's a little bit cautious. They tend to go toward the compensation hypothesis, but there might be many explanations for why this happens. So yeah, but the empirical data, that's the
okay, thank
result.
you.
I think you have another question.
We're closing the circle. Last question.
Yeah, just a last one. Just curious, did we look at the accuracies in younger people as well? Because it would be nice to see, where young and old people differentiate. Let me know if I missed anything.
Yeah, so I didn't go into details for what concerns the younger population, but this paper is exactly on that topic. There's not much difference in some areas, but they do all the contrast and the investigation related to younger people. But yeah, as you can see, for example, in this is from the older paper with the younger subjects. So in areas where there's a strong preference for sentences against noise, there's not a big mismatch between object or subject relative clauses or like acoustically rich or less rich sentences. But in some other areas there is a modulation. So you can, if you're interested in the younger sample, I would suggest to give a read to this paper.
Oh, so we look at the differences between old and young in this.
No, this is just the younger population. The comparison.
Oh, okay, yeah.
The comparison.
Okay,
In this paper, they collect new data from the older population, and they compare some of these data to some of the data from the previous experiment.
Because I'm curious how that would differ, because it's quite evident that for more complex tasks, we do recruit, even young people recruit right hemisphere. So I'm just curious how that would differ between older and younger populations. But obviously that's not in a paper. It's just, I'm just curious if they, looked into that.
Well, there is this direct comparison between young and older population. So even if the younger population is to recruit the right hemisphere, the older population is recruiting it more, I would say. But it should probably look more into the data to see what's the. I mean, there's still also in the younger population, there is still somehow kind of bilateral network. If you look at the red areas, which is the sentence more than noise, you still see the classic broad left hemisphere set of areas that correspond to the language network, but you still have areas that, the right hemisphere as well, like interior, superior temporal areas, somehow frontal areas. But yeah. In this older paper, if you're interested, they analyze a little bit more in detail the condition, the difference in the acoustically rich and poor condition, which is something that is somehow a little bit lost in this paper. They don't analyze it in details, I think. Yeah.
Great, thank you. That is spot on, 10 o'clock. Thank you so much. I wish you all a really nice summer break. Enjoy your conferences, your holidays, and I'm looking forward to seeing you after the break again for the next season of Neuroccino. Until then, have a fantastic summer. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.